What's going on, everybody? This is the fifth episode of the MarYoda podcast channel. Today we will interview Birdler. Alright, so Birdler, can you introduce yourself to the public?
Sure. Well, I'm Beard. I have a couple different accounts, but Beard is my name. I've been playing 2B since 2017, May 2017, I'm pretty sure. I checked the exact date at one point, but I don't have it committed to memory. I've been playing Minecraft as a whole on a couple different accounts, but I am pretty sure I started in either 2013 or 15. Um, but I don't remember exactly.
When did you purchase your first Minecraft account?
Um, Probably 2013, but that'd be back before I was anywhere near serious with it. Um, the account that eventually became the Builder account, I am pretty sure I got in 2015 or early 2016.
Okay. What got you hooked to Minecraft? Like, what do you enjoy the most doing in Minecraft besides stupidity? Like, Minecraft as a game, not the multiplayer section of it.
Um, Quite frankly, well, I think I actually started playing Minecraft as a whole just because of the, creative freedom and such, initially, but I really only play the game for the multiplayer aspect at this point. Um, I've Yeah, I don't particularly find the single player and such mechanics as interesting as otherwise, but the ability to be creative and such in this setting anyway, I think is done better than it is in uh, other games of a similar variety.
So you
It's not
basically,
perfect, but
yeah. So you basically like the freedom that you have in the game, that it's a sandbox game.
yeah, um, yeah, I like the degree of freedom it affords, um, and particularly in how it is a sandbox game that doesn't like restrict you to this pre-designed model X, Y, and Z, but it's all the grid. I like the grid.
Okay. Before you joined 2BTT, did you play on any other servers?
Yes, before so the to keep a long story short, initially I had started out playing on some YouTuber's server. I don't even remember who. But like some really generic SMP back in 2016 or something, early 2016, I believe. Um, and I remember very distinctly that I had gotten my account banned from it, like temporarily or something, after I had mined, I think, like some sort of, I think it was a furnace, like in some unclaimed area or something. And apparently that's against the rules. Shrug. Um,
What?
and after yeah, I know, it was stupid. And I'm like, "Okay, whatever." So I started looking for another server after that, and that took me to Minewind, um, which is terrible. And it has just gone, I mean, it was terrible back then, it has gone even further downhill, since then. Um, but the easiest way to explain that is glorified factions, anarchy with rules. Any one of those sort of tries to be something it isn't descriptors goes perfectly well there. Um, but that is the server where I really started getting into the multiplayer aspects of the game. Um, got more into building there, really. I was terrible at first, to be fair. Um, I got more comfortable with scale before I actually started to get interested in improving detail and such. Some of the people I met there were rather influential in my build style. I talked with one of the guys who was really influential in my early style of building every once in a while. I don't remember if I still have contact with him. He changes his username and profile picture and such on Discord very often. But what ended up happening is that around, yeah, I fish. Okay, so I first joined 2B um, in, I think, May 2017, just because I'm pretty sure the story there is that some thing had happened where on Minewind, some people had gotten really pissed off because, with air quotes here, players from 2B had apparently hacked into one of the really established people's on that server, their account, um, and had like leaked and destroyed a bunch of stuff, including a couple of my things, honestly. And so I was interested in like, oh, who are these people from 2B who are all so immensely powerful and such, and everyone on the server fears them and such, and it was all really cringy and larpy back then as it was. I know, I was only like, I think I was only 13 at the time, to be fair. But that's the basic thing. I think, yeah, early 2017, I started looking more into 2B. I quite honestly really delved into looking up stuff about the server's history back then, even though it wasn't anywhere near as well documented as it is nowadays. I read through a lot of stuff on the early wikis. I um, had gone through a lot of the original forums, watched most of the videos that were available back then, um, and so on and so forth. But most of the information I had at the time was, more focused on the whole Rusher thing and um, related things to it. I think it was the Arch Quantum Imgur post that I had actually originally joined, um, that had inspired me to join. Um, and so, May 2017, queued up. We had like what? I think 3, 4, 5, probably 6 hours back then to get in. Um, like took a screenshot and then immediately logged off. That was basically the how that was. Yeah. Um, and I continued to play on the server like here and there um, until I want to say July or August 2017. Um, because when I actually started to get like really into playing 2B was when I was banned from Minewind, like permanently banned, because of the crafting book dupe. Because yes, it is an quote unquote anarchy server, and you can get banned for duping, because of course. Um, and so immediately after that, I was like, okay, I've been spending most of my time there. I need to find someplace else to go. So 2B is a logical conclusion because I'd already started to get my stuff established there. I'd started up a base. It's on the archive nowadays. It's called Eleusis, Eleusis. Um, and that was basically mostly me building. A couple friends of mine from here and there, none of them 2B players really, had joined the base. Only one other guy, who was a Minewind player, Quasar, built one build there. The rest of it was all me, and I like to use that base as an example of, yeah, my early build style was basically just all scale and not much else. Um, but what ended up happening there, at that base anyway, was some random. player ended up wandering through the base while I was building there one day, and me and the guy who was more active there otherwise, decided that it had had a good run, and we decided to self grief. Um, Around the same time as that, I had found a stash which I'd moved decently far away from that location. But I'd also, gotten my first kit while I was walking down the highway to that location initially. Um, and after having found my first stash back then, and I should point out that is the only time I've ever found a stash on 2B. It is, yeah, I've never been one for finding things per se. I just go to coordinates when I get them. That's more my style. Um, and that was basically where I collected all the stuff from that. We would do a different location and existed off of that until all the all the stuff that happened in June of 2018. Um, a thing I don't think most people would notice about my early period on 2B was actually that most of the stuff I'd been doing initially was just exploring. Like after Eleusis, after we destroyed it, I just decided to go exploring because um, I think that was when I'd initially been inspired by Fit's whole archive thing initially to help out with that sort of stuff. But I was more interested, in actually helping out with that sort of stuff when the museum server started to get launched and such. When I initially started exploring and getting downloads and such for them, that was more what I had in mind. Um, I had started to get disillusioned with Fit when he griefed Summermelon because I felt, and to be fair, a really large proportion of the community felt that he had griefed that base for views. I personally always would cite the fact that a decent portion of the people who built at that base were people who he had either praised in previous videos or considered friends at some point in the past, and it just seemed so shallow and such. Anyway, um, but no, it was the archive had originally got the whole not archive, Project Vault. That's what I'm thinking of. Vault was what initially got me interested in the whole archival sort of deal. When the museum got set up, that's when I started to try and help out myself. As far as I'm aware, currently on the archive, the server has come after the museum and such, hosted by Turban, who is amazing. Um, I A few things that I'd actually downloaded back when I was working for the museum are still there. For example, one of the first things I did in the whole downloading spree that I went on back in 2017 would actually, well, the whole story is that I just kind of, you know, Electroflight was still at its like most overpowered back then. So I just kind of flew from place to place. He had no reason to go into the Never, really, in my mind, because you just get there as quickly overworld with Packet Electrofly, if I remember correctly. Um, so I downloaded a couple things around, around Spawn, or under the millions, I should say, um, that I had gone towards to this way or the other, but mostly just stuff that was like on Tubi.online, I think, um, but wasn't on the museum yet. Um, and it was a combination of all those downloads. I don't think I gathered too many, probably a dozen or so. Um, from that I actually submitted. And then I decided to take a month out of my time on Tubi, um, get in a pig and go pig speed to the world border, since Burnsy's dig team and such had just finished that, and then head over to the world corner. Um, and along the way, I downloaded basically every waypoint, one of those rest stop things that had been built, that was at least somewhat intact, um, and continued all the way over to the um, corner, downloaded what little stuff I could in the meantime. As far as I'm aware, all the stuff on the archive right now, um, for the little rest stops along the way to the plus X border, and some of the things, I'm not sure which one specifically, most of the Neverside stuff, if I'm not mistaken, along the way to the corner, were taken by me, um, alongside the um, it was the download of the 30 million by 10 million um, rest stop base thing on the overworld side, but had a giant glass tree and stuff at it, which is cool. I was surprised to see it so intact, honestly. Um, Other than that, there was, but anyway, so I'd gotten, I sent all that stuff over to um, Toma, and he invited me onto the staff team for the um, the museum. I'm decently sure at least part of that decision was influenced by the fact that I had, time to kill. I was happy to look at any chords they'd give me to check out, and I had been, giving him more stuff than I think that he himself could manage at the time, anyway. Um, and the completely oversimplified version of events is that you know, got I got onto the museum staff team and quickly started to rise in the ranks on Tubi, in social strata, and but mostly just because um, having to work with, well, of course, associating with the people on the museum staff team got me a lot of connections, and having to work with people from all around the community really um, got me in contact with a lot of people, such as um, R2, R2B Eden, who was the guy who had initially founded the base that would become Oceania. The story there actually is that I'd been assigned to help him out with getting his, I think, first main base, the Mender's base, on the museum. And we talked for a little bit, and he invited me to the base that he had started up following that one, which was nameless at the time, but we ended up naming it Oceania since it was, island base and such. And that became my main base for the first half of 2018. Um, and so what happened from that point on? I mean, I'd also okay. I'd also gotten invited to the Bodek and Bike Haynes Law. That was a invite he had sent me, I think almost exclusively just because I was involved with museum staff, and he was like, "Do you need a base or something?" I don't remember the exact way it went down, but that's just how it was. I think he took a risk. Um, and around the same time, I had also been working with Slapping Bad Kids, um, uh, for, I don't remember exactly which base it was that he had needed my assistance with for the museum, but what he had sent me for that included the region files for Block Game Mecha. And he decided that, well, since I already had the coordinates now, he might as well just invite me. So I'm like, oh, okay. So there you go. Invited to Blockade Mecca, basically by accident, really. And I invited him over to Oceania, my main base, in good faith, really. And he started working on a gold farm there, if I'm not mistaken. Um, and those free bases were really the main ones I had been invited to. There's a couple other ones that I had at the time. Um, None of them too major, really, or at least none of them that I'd actually ended up going to and devoting a lot of time to. Um, I really was working on three things simultaneously towards, let's say, May 2018. And those were Oceania, of course, and starting to do some stuff at the Bodecan. The thing about my build over at the Bodecan, um, and that whole area that I'd started up is that I I I think I actually just completely forgot what I actually had been planning to do. Um, like halfway through it, and then I tried to continue a slightly different, alteration of the original idea. Didn't pan out too well. I remember in Fast Vincent's video, he'd mentioned that they had been planning to remove it or something along those lines, and I can't blame them. It was terrible. I legitimately cannot blame them. It was not a. It was very much not the best, and yeah, uh, no, I don't disagree. Um, but the whole thing really come okay. Getting ahead of myself again. No, I actually hadn't gone over to Blockade Mecca at that point. Um, Towards the end of May 2018, a lot of things really bottlenecked really quickly, um, in terms of things that have been going on really rather slowly up until that point. It all happened pretty much all at once. One of the things that I'd been working on at that point was a base, base group that had been spawned out of some sort of Discord oriented kind of LARPy guild thing that I'd been hoping to get set up back then. Um, but the whole Builders Guild thing turned into the Builders Haven base group. Um, and while I was with them, we built Purgatory 1 and 2. I always think that Purgatory was an accidental title, and it just kind of stuck because the Builder's Haven was so close to Builder's Heaven, and there's a lot of and some people got the terms mixed up, and we just kind of rolled with it. Anyway, so Builder's Haven, the Purgatory One was always in, all the Purgatory bases actually were intended to just be temp bases. We'd been planning on building, Builder's Haven proper when the server updated, which yeah, we've been waiting on that for a
Yeah.
very long time now. Uh, but yeah, Purgatory One, I think lasted, I think a week at most. Really, we had a one of my accounts was a we were using as a base alt at parked there. I think Life is Good 72 was the guy who had logged into it in Grifa base. Um, a lot of people have changed since back then. I think is a
Yeah.
pretty fair statement to say. Um, then from there, actually, I mean, that base got really big really quickly, just because of how the Builders Haven group was structured at the time. Because the whole policy was if you were in the public Discord and you were a builder, you could join the base. That was as simple as it was, and all you need to do is like show us pictures showing us that you can do better than like a box. And as you can imagine, at the purgatory bases and such, there was a huge variety of quality, especially very early on, which I think is good. To be fair, I think when bases are all just the best of the best, it can get stuffy at times, because it creates this. You want to, you don't want to get anything under a certain level, and I feel that at times that mentality only pushes people to put for absolute best stuff there. And I mean, for people like me, I don't like that. I like it when a base is someplace where you can just put what you want and have areas to do X, Y, and Z, but not have to really force yourself to do the best quality. Actually, the base that a lot of the Builders Haven guys went to, I don't remember per se if the groups kind of merged or not. If I'm not mistaken, Valerian was the base. Um, I'm pretty sure Valerian had existed before um, Builders Haven was a thing, but a lot of Builders Haven members went there, and whether it was a connection, I don't know. I like to say yes, because of course I do. I don't know for sure, but I use that as a perfect illustration of my point. It's a great base, and there's a great variety of styles and skill levels there, and it works really well. Um, and the thing is that to not to jump it around too much, but trying to keep focus on this. After Purgatory 1 fell, a lot of us really quickly left and went to a new location. Um, I think it was Warlord Nick, who had one of his like near spawn stashes or something. Relatively old one. He didn't care too much about it, if I'm not mistaken. Um, Basically the same distance out. Some I think a little bit further down the highway, or maybe a little bit closer in. Um, but he offered it up to us as a location to use. We all jumped at the bait since he was. We all went over there, and Builders Haven Purgatory 2 only lasted about 2.5 weeks, because of all the drama that would start to pop up later on. Um, and um, After all that, of course, that had happened, I mean, that base grew very quickly, of course, because it was both public, relatively long lasting, considering what it was, effectively a public base. Um, and we were very relaxed about the invite policy. I mean, there was multiple instances back with that base that I had just basically run a taxi service, where if I found some random player who seemed cool enough on the highway, I'd just bring them straight to the base. Um, and I'm pretty sure that at the time, the largest base by population had been Asgard 2, and we had more members than that by the time it was griefed. Um, and but of course, when it was griefed, I was ousted from the group because of other things, and those other things is the more interesting thing, to be perfectly fair. Is what most people think of when they think of my story. I'd venture a guess, considering, I mean, that's what Fit has focused on in his 2 videos and such.
Hmm.
But that whole instance really comes down to a couple things that all just happened. Pretty close together. I mean, May 2015 was when Jared was basically just going on a purge. He griefed 31 bases in 31 days, month of destruction, all that sort of stuff. And one of those bases, well, not to get too ahead of myself, at that in that time frame, um, I had taken all the collectibles and such from the Bodekin and grief a base. The story behind that, though, is not related really to Tubi at all, honestly. It all came down to I was an archivist, so I wasn't about to blow up the base with the artifacts and stuff inside of it. That was never the intention. Um, I had been going through rather um, a pretty rough patch in my life, just put it lightly. I'm not going to go too much into detail about that. I've gone significantly more into detail on that elsewhere,
Yeah.
which is posted publicly on Reddit, I think.
Oh, yeah, I think I've seen that.
Yeah, I typically direct people to that post whenever I'm talking about this sort of stuff. But of course, you have the people who like to hear it, audio and such. So here we are. Um, But the whole situation basically came down to I destroyed the base for reasons completely disconnected from Tubi, really. Um, and I think a lot of the issue is, I mean, right from the beginning, came down to the supposed cover up. I mean, I was 14 at the time. Um, and, I didn't really find the idea of, you know, telling some of the most well known people on the server, you know, hey, I fucked up, etc., etc., etc. Um, so I decided that the easiest course of action was to point out that like I found a sign like 1K away from the base location a couple days before maybe that person had leaked question mark. Jared was going on his whole thing and like very, very much so at the time, and I'd message him occasionally about that sort of stuff at the time. But I never directed blame to him. I think a couple people obviously considered him, and the possibility that someone had just randomly stumbled across the Bodekin was very likely from the very beginning, considering it was 7K off axis, 187K out, and within 2K of two bases that had been griefed in years prior. It was a no-brainer, really, to assume that it could have been griefed by just someone passing through. Um, but the thing is that I had two main accounts that I had been using on Tubi at the time. The one that I had parked at the Bodekin, that left the Bodekin after I destroyed it. That account went straight to Block Game Mecca. I had not actually been to Block Game Mecca before that point. Um, Meanwhile, you have my other account, which is technically my alt account, but I was using it interchangeably really back then. And that one had just been sitting there working on the base um, basically since since the beginning of 2018, with minimal things happening elsewhere. For exploration purposes, for helping out at other things, etc. Generally, I did that stuff on the Bueller account, not the alt. And a couple people had just started to arrive um, at Oceania around when it was destroyed. But the real question for us was the circumstances surrounding its destruction. Because basically everyone who we'd invited was either a real life friend of one of the original members, myself or R2, one of our close trusted friends from elsewhere on the server, or a builder with a spotless reputation. or near spotless, anyway.
Mm-hmm.
And there's one exception, a grand total of one exception, and that was Slappin, because we knew that he associated with Jared. We knew that he associated with a lot of people who were known for griefing, and so he was an obvious suspect for who could have leaked. And of course, our mind had initially went to, well, we know it was Jared, and that was only confirmed when I think, yeah, Jared had confirmed, or Jumpy had confirmed for him, um, that they had griefed it, and to show that, and to prove to us that it had been one of the members, they sent us the uh, a picture that I had sent to all members who had been arriving at the base, for what the exact coords of the base are, the portal coords. So we knew from the get go that it had been incited by one of the base members. Um, and that whole thing really culminated, uh, I'd say about a week later at most. I don't remember off the top of my head exactly what day that was that it was destroyed. I think it was May 29th. It was either like 2 or 3, it was within 2 or 3 days of when I griefed the Bodekin. But um, yeah, the whole thing ended up becoming that on the, I want to say the night, it was either the night of May 31st or June 1st. I had been in a call with R2 and a base member of who had, if I'm not mistaken, been invited to Oceania and had been a member of Purgatory 2. And I had moved the account that I had parked um, at Oceania over to Purgatory 2, if I'm not mistaken. I sometimes get confused which account was where, but you know. And I moved that account, or whichever account, I was at Purgatory 2 on one of my accounts. Most of the other guys were there as well. It was the obvious point of exodus, really. And I'd been in a call with those guys, which I didn't do often back then. And eventually, it was R2, Odorous, and I, we'd been speculating as to who did it, what to do. And eventually R2 left. Odorous and I were basically just bantering about it. And we'd already effectively narrowed down the options to just Slappin. We weren't even really considering anyone else at that point. And he's like, "Oh, we should get revenge on him." And I'm like, "Well, we could." I mean, only a day or two before that, really. Um, I had the account I'd been moving over to Block Game Mecca actually arrive at the base, and I dropped off a significant portion of the collectibles I'd had from around the server at that point. Including the stuff from Bodek and including various things throughout my travels. Um, and those all ended up at Draft Adder's Museum at Block Game Mecca. Um, Fun little detail I want to point out to correct the record. Some people claim that if I hadn't griefed Block Game Mecca, I would have gotten away with the Bodekin. That is a complete fallacy, considering that one of the main guys who had helped, that had pointed out initially that I had been involved in both bases' destruction, was the only other member of both bases, which was Yellowstone Joe. And I can guarantee that even if, I hadn't griefed Blocking Mecca, he would have eventually gone to Giraffe Adder's Museum, found the books that I had taken from the Bodekin, and been like, "Oh shit, wait a minute," you know. So no, it was hardly foolproof from the very beginning. Um, but anyway, so what ended up happening there is I gave Odorous access to the base account there. And I basically just started. We started over at. Well, we explored the base for a little bit just to make sure we knew what was there. At the time, in that server that we had set up that had been used for that base, the policy for the base account was just say when you're using it. So, obviously, I just didn't say that I had been using it. Um, and so, Odorous went on it. I went on the account that I just moved there. We explored the base a little bit, took what valuables we could fit in our chests and stuff and such. Then we went over to Draftfighter's Museum, and he loaded up a lot of his alts, which he had given prio or were not full access or something. I don't even know at this point. But we basically ended up just purling all of the collectibles to his accounts, um, and then grew the base from there. I don't think I actually ended up having any of the collectibles really. Um, I had a small cache of supplies that I'd made after we finished at the base that night, and I went to it back in 2021, and I didn't find anything. I found the suit of armor and tools that I'd been wearing at the time in a shulker, and some TNT, and that was basically it. There was nothing else of importance or value there. Um, so whenever people have asked, why don't you just return V artifacts? Well, it's because I don't have them. I haven't had them since then, actually. No, I never have. And apparently, from what I've heard and been told and such, Odorous has completely cut ties with the community. He's offered to sell. So, some people have approached him trying to buy the the artifacts off of him, and as far as I'm aware, he has scammed every single person who has attempted to buy from him. Even years later, some people never change.
I see.
Um, but I tried to keep that relatively under wraps. And of course, thanks to I think it was a combination of Mafra looking at, or I think it was Mafra looking at the world download, or was it Alpha Computer? Someone involved in there. Ended up looking over at the Block Game Mecha world download I had taken shortly before the grief. Realized that some of the artifacts I'd had in those shulkers were directly connected to the Bodekin, tied me to both locations at the time of the grief, etc., etc., etc. The story writes itself from that point on. But that took until, I'd say, June 16th, if I'm not mistaken. And that was really the day everything fell apart. Back in May, to jump back real quick, while I was working with the museum and on so on and so forth, we also have Jared going through all of his stuff. And we began to suspect that Jared had been getting at least some of his locations that he had been destroying over the course of a month from the museum. And so I basically put out a notice to some of the people who had been helping me out with stuff on the museum. Hey, just let me know if you see Jared online. I think it was Magic, who had pointed out to me that Jared was on at a time which I was just not home. I was, I think, out driving, doing something with my parents. And he asked me, "Hey, what do I do?" And I'm like, "Oh, just IP ban him." You know, short and simple. And so he did, and then he messaged me that it had returned Jared's IP address, and he sent me Jared's IP address. And the only person I actually ever sent Jared's IP address to was Slappin. Why? I don't know. I guess it seemed like the thing to do. I wasn't really thinking it was the best back then, to be fair. As far as I'm aware, though, he also sent it to a couple other people who attempted to create a dox on Jared. Um, although it's been long enough that I don't remember who most of the people are, and I'm not particularly interested in slandering anyone who wasn't directly involved or, you know, who was only tangentially involved. I'm not interested in that. But alongside all that other stuff coming out, Mothra leaked one of the books that I had left in one of the shulkers, which had been given to me by Offtopia while I was at Viper Base, which was museum staff base effectively. Um, and that book included coordinates to a bunch of other locations around Spawn that he had compiled, but also apparently accidentally, is what he had told me prior to that. He had included the coordinates to Numenor, which is where Crowbar's mother of all keeps, his, Offtopia's Clockwork Isle was, and a bunch of other things. By Willie Roof Saito, and I think Drud had started something. Although I'm pretty sure that isn't as well documented. And that was a really, really nasty situation, to say the least. I mean, I think that some of the worst fallout from that whole thing was with some of the people who I'd been close with up until that point, because they've been trying to defend me because they thought that that was what was the right thing to do. They actually, Fit had accused Oftopia and Tom and a couple other people, if I'm not mistaken, of having tried to create some whole conspiracy around the whole situation, trying to protect me and such. It's not true. It never was. The whole situation was actually just that I had lied to them as much as I'd lied to everyone else. Period. Um, and I paid the price. Um, in and yeah, a couple folks from I want to say it was a combination of some guys from Black and Mecca and Bodek and went to Grief Purgatory 2. I got ousted from that group. The Purgatory team went on to do another 2 Purgatory bases, one of which was Purgatory 4, which has public coordinates and has long since been griefed. No download exists. And you have Purgatory 5, aka Exposition, which, as far as I'm aware, does not have any public coordinates and no public download exists. They also created a final main base, which was, just Builder's Haven, which was a Never base, which was griefed last year. Although it had not been continuously occupied at any regard, really. Most of those guys, by that point of the project, had fully pivoted over to Valerian. The only other major thing that happened to me at that point, outside of Slappin revealing that I had Sharon's IP address, and the obvious conclusion was, oh, I had gotten it. I hadn't, but that wasn't obvious at the time. I think Magic or someone in a similar position to me had gotten the stash I mentioned, from back in the days of
Yeah.
Eleusis. He had griefed that, and I was not too pleased about that because that had been a stash that I'd been sharing with a couple of my other close friends at that point. And by the end of that whole fiasco, I'd basically lost most favorable opinions with the people who I'd been close with at the time. I started up one final base on 2B at that point, called Petrichor, which is where I actually logged back when I resumed playing in 2020. My life had actually just continued spiraling from that point forward, and by August, I had gotten wrapped up in a mental hospital, which is basically where I was stuck for the latter half of 2018 and basically continuing through until mid 2020, at which point I'd slowly reintegrated with the community. I mean, some people claimed that I'd quietly returned. No, I didn't quietly return. I'd made very, very public that I'd returned. I'd made a Reddit post immediately as soon as I started playing. Honestly, I didn't even use alts at first. I only started to use alts when needing to be multiple different places at once became a major concern.
Mhm.
And the only time I ever really used alts in any recently, at least, with the specific intention of avoiding negative attention was, after Fit's second video about me. I actually had and that's a whole other situation unto itself because I had actually taken a prolonged break from 2B at that point. And it was actually that video that got me back into playing 2B. Because I, of course, was quickly forced to uh, get back into the community to set some things right. Made the Reddit post that I mentioned earlier, and some other things.
Right. Um,
Um,
uh,
it was also then that Slapman had actually revealed that he had been the guy behind that the League of Oceania to begin with, and he explained that um, the reason he had leaked Oceania to Jared was because Jared had known that Slapin had access to Oceania and basically put forth the ultimatum to him: "Hey, you're gonna leak Oceania to me, or I'm gonna grief blacking Mecca." And Slapin decided to choose the lesser of two evils, I suppose. And I don't think he expected that I would quickly figure it out and retaliate.
right. I have a special question for you right now.
All
So,
right.
if none of this was true, like you never joined 2BTT, would you prefer to live the same experience or live a different like person in anarchy?
Well, um, I think that the experiences that I had in the first stretch of my time on 2B, which, as I've just described, um, have shaped me as a person and almost exclusively for the better, I think. Since I've come back to 2B, I've learned a lot about myself and I've, figured out a lot more stuff about my relationship within the server and so on and so forth. And um, I feel that this most recent period of me playing, since 2020, um, has just been a continuation of good things, really. Um, I mean, when I first got back to 2B in 2020, um, I knew very few people who still played. I got in contact with those few people. Um, Started up a Discord server called the Brotherhood, which was just casual VCs and stuff. We attempted a couple bases, and none of them really panned out too much. Too much, um, but it created a pretty tight knit community initially. Well, at least tightened it enough. And through that, I got in contact with a couple other people from back in the olden days and such. Boofer had contacted me. Um, I don't remember what month exactly, but he reached out to me about the possibility, or at least I suppose asking for my blessing in breathing life back into the whole Builder's Haven concept of bases. And of course, he and I worked on that for a little bit. That's where we have Builder's Haven 2 as a group pop up, which turned out two bases, Limbosity and Bernheim. Limbosity is more similar to Purgatory 2 and what it ended up being. And Bernheim was more of a main base for the more involved group members, plus a couple friends. Um, Eventually, I'm pretty sure it was Ztrax who had incited that for Orson to gave the chords to Jared and not Jared, to Fit and company, and they made that whole video, which culminated in the second Fit video about me from last year. Um, as I mentioned, it was a bit annoying since I had distanced myself from 2B basically a month prior to that. At that point, and the only reason I really got back involved in the community was to respond to that whole situation. And it took me another, I think, a month after even I made that post to start playing again on an alt that time, which was Spawn Patrol, which is still one of the two um, not full access accounts I have that I play on 2B with
Mm-hmm.
regularly. Um, but shortly after, I started getting more established on 2B again, following all that. I'm pretty sure it was August 2021. Um, Joey Coconut, and Galv reached out to me, raising the possibility of me joining them with Astral, and he's just like, "Well, just apply," and I'm like, "Okay." So I applied, got in. Didn't do too much at first because I'd been focusing on a base that I was working on. That I started up, when I was trying to keep a low profile initially, and from that point forward, I basically just focused on that until I got griefed, and then I just needed someplace a little bit, quieter to work on. And that's how I started really getting more involved with Astral. Started VCing with them a lot more, um, and I ended up helping out a lot with. Um, I'm pretty sure OCAB was the first Astral base that I actually really put time towards. Um, and and that was early December, if not mistaken. And about midway through December, I ended up helping out with um, Nautilus, the which is funny because actually it would be the second time that I've assisted in a project that would have gained the title largest drain or drain-like structure